If we're all sitting here not talking to each other, that'd be a big problem. I'm glad that we could talk and fellowship and share concern and love for each other. Now let's turn to Matthew chapter 7. We'll continue our study on the Sermon on the Mount. Appreciate Steve Grubb filling in last week. Watched the video and appreciate him covering the class on chapter 6. We'll be in chapter 7 today. We'll do a quick recap on chapter 6 in just a minute. Watching the video, Steve did a good job asking, is Steve here today? Is he home? Not feeling good? He is here? Okay. Steve did a good job, pausing, asking a lot of questions, getting thoughts, and it's one thing I need to do better. Sometimes I just start rambling and turn into lecture mode, and definitely don't want to be that. So let's make sure even if we have a small crowd, we have a lot of conversations so we learn from each other. Because if the teacher never knows everything, the teacher's got to keep learning, and everybody's got to learn from each other. All right, before we get started this morning, Doug, can I ask you to lead us in prayer? Amen. Thank you. All right, so lesson 6 in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. In continuing the Sermon on the Mount, every time we start a class, I want us to remember, this is not a bunch of isolated sayings of Jesus, but a continuous sermon. And as we study, everything builds upon previous lessons that we've learned. So we talked about Matthew chapter 5, that portion focuses a lot on our attitude. It's not just good enough to not do something bad. You got to get rid of the bad thoughts and the intentions. Chapter 6, more about doing things with the right motivation, not doing things to be seen by man, having the right spiritual focus, serving the right spiritual master. And then chapter 7 turns our thoughts to our relationships. So after chapter 5, chapter 6, after getting our own heads on straight spiritually, then we're focusing on relationships with others. I really like what the book here says at the top of page 37. The author writes, Christianity is not an individual value system, but is a community affair involving our relationship with others. So nobody is a Christian in a vacuum. It can't just be about I didn't lie, cheat, or steal today, therefore I am a good Christian. It's about how we interact. And John, he said that we will be known by our love. If we are loving each other as Christians, we are pursuing that same kind of self-sacrificial relationship that Christ showed for us. So chapter 7 is largely about the relationships, and the book summarizes that very well. Verses 1 through 5 of chapter 7 is relationship with our brethren. It says we don't judge in a hypocritical way. We don't judge to be holier than thou, but we should discern between right and wrong, and we should observe when some of our brethren need help. And we should judge ourselves to know if we have a plank in our eye, so we could go rightfully help remove a speck from a brother's eye. So do not judge hypocritically, but you do need to watch out for right and wrong, and when you could apply that and support your brethren. There's a relationship with that righteous judging. Verse 6, there's a relationship with those who refuse the gospel. Don't give dogs what is holy. Don't throw your pearls before swine. Know when is a time to evangelize, when is not a good time to evangelize, and go and put your efforts elsewhere. How we deal with those who refuse the gospel is just as critical as how we approach those seeking to share the gospel, because if it's not a good opportunity to share the gospel, we don't want to close the door. You don't want to burn bridges, but you want to leave that opening there. Verses 7 through 11, which Steve taught last week. Ask and it will be given, seek and you'll find, knock and it will be opened. This is our petitioning relationship with our Father. The class talked a lot about prayer. Then we'll pause and do a quick recap there. So from last week, let's just reread verse 7 through 11 together. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So in verse 7, what kind of progression do we see there? What do we do first? To ask, seek, and knock. You don't want to just go and knock randomly without seeking where to knock. You don't want to start seeking without knowing what you're going to ask for once you get to a place where you could ask about it. So we ask, we seek, we knock. There's action there. And there's a purpose behind that. Now, last week there was a lot of discussion about prayer. What kind of mindset, what kind of attitude we need to show when we pray and ask and seek and knock? Attitudes that we show. We got to ask with sincerity. We got to ask with confidence, knowing that God will listen. We got to be faithful, knowing that God will provide. Humble, knowing that we are the sinners who are seeking to be saved. We are the children looking for a blessing from the Father. That humility, not God, you owe me this. And then when we pray, what should we be praying for? The spiritual things, not the materialistic. As Steve was talking about, we don't go and pray for a Mercedes. You pray for what you need spiritually. You pray for the right things, knowing that God will answer. And then God always say yes. God will sometimes say no to us, depending on what we're asking. The circumstances, God knows better than we do. Sometimes it might seem like a no to us, but to God it is a later. These things we don't know, but that goes back to asking in humility and faithfulness. As we take the answer we're given, and we know that God provides what we need, and sometimes we got to think about our mindset and recognizing that we have what we need instead of dwelling on what we don't have. So our relationship with our Father, and if you notice in verse 7, the example is of which one of you, if his son asks him. It's not a brother asking, it's not a co-worker, it is a son asking. So that illustration uses that same son-father relationship. So again, we are not petitioning a distant God. We aren't petitioning a God that is, started the world and abandoned, let it turn on its own, as some people think, but it's a relationship. And it's not sometimes in a lot of, mega church Christianity could come across as a real cheesy relationship. I saw a parody video saying, is this a pop culture Christianity song about a boyfriend or is it about God? Because sometimes it gets really cheesy and almost too, what's the right word I'm looking for? Reverent. We have a close relationship but still reverent, where it's not Jesus is our homeboy, but God is our heavenly Father that we can petition without having any sort of cheesy, flippant relationship. So finally in verse 12, we get to relationship with our neighbor. And who is our neighbor? Nope. Donnie answers, our neighbor is anybody who is in need and we have an opportunity to help them out. And so our relationship with our neighbor should be like relationship with ourselves. We're told to love ourselves, love others as ourselves. So verse 12, let's go ahead and read that. We should have read it before I started rambling. Verse 12, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So whatever you wish that others would do, we should do to others. Do to us, we should do to others. So before we dive into some of the application, where it says, this is the law and the prophets. What does it mean that this is the law and the prophets? Yep. And Donnie's answer to that question, what does it mean, this is the law and the prophets? Donnie says, this sums up the law and the prophets. If you take all the commandments, all the laws, and you boil it down into the simplest possible words, here we have it. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. Think about a similar wording in Matthew, as far as this is the law and the prophets, or similar summation. I'm thinking about Matthew 22, if you turn there with me really quick. I'm beginning in verse 34. Matthew 22, verse 34. We'll read this passage of several verses, and we'll see an application at the end. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second commandment is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So the Pharisees were trying to put Jesus to the test and catch him in a no-win answer. They were trying to say, out of the 10 commandments in the Decalogue and out of all the 600 or so commandments that follow, specifying applications of the law, which is the greatest? Trying to get Jesus to say one is greater than all 600 or so. But Jesus, instead of picking out one, he summarizes into 2 points. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then it concludes, on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So it's similar if you take all the law. There's so much detail we read about Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and you just go and boil that down in the simplest words. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then similarly here, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. And if we were to turn to the law of Moses and read all that, we could go one by one and say, how does that apply to loving God and to loving your neighbor? The first the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Obviously, God doesn't want other gods to, pagan false gods to take attention away from serving him. Therefore, love God the most and ignore all the cultural pagan temptations. And we could go some through all of them, which we obviously won't do today. So this is referred to as the golden rule here, and the book calls it the Everest of ethics. Some of the commandments, some of the laws are easier to do than others. For example, thou shalt not murder. Jesus mentioned that in chapter 5. I'd say it's fairly easy not to murder people. It's harder to get rid of the angry thoughts in your mind. But some of the more difficult, where you think about people that you don't necessarily like, but you still need to show love and compassion for. That's why this author calls this lesson the Everest of ethics. All right, so turn to page 38 in the book if you're following along. The author starts making a distinguishing between morality. And morality typically culturally defined in terms of things that we should not do. Going back to the Ten Commandments, which are all thou shalt not. But again, going back to chapter 5, is Christianity based on just what we don't do? Is Christianity all about not sinning, or is there more to it than that? Yep. Yep. And Doug says the other side of the coin is the doing side, and that's a good way to put it. So this workbook calls it, positive, negative, active, passive. Doug says the doing side. Now, sometimes this golden rule gets misquoted in our culture, doesn't it? If you don't want someone to do it to you, don't do it to them. If you don't want somebody to punch you in the arm, don't punch other people in the arm. Brethren, I thank all of you for not punching me in the arm this morning as I came in the door. Because y'all didn't punch me in the arm, I know that y'all love me. Well, guess what? If you go to Food City, you can walk by 80 people that don't punch you in the arm. Does that mean that they love you with the same Christian love? And that's the point that Jesus is getting to. The Everest of ethics. It is harder to go and show active love by doing than it is to simply abstain from punching people in the arm. Let's turn, this passage isn't in the workbook, but let's turn to James also. James talks about motivation, and does our faith actually cause us to act differently? James chapter 1, verse 27, we'll read two passages. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So this shows true religion requires action to go and love those who are overlooked, underserved, going through difficult times, tough places. And then flip a page, James chapter 2, verses 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and any one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now, we aren't going to debate, are we saved by faith or are we saved by works? That's could often be a dead-end conversation unless we talk about faith that transforms. What James is getting at is if we have faith, that should transform our actions. It's not good to have knowledge without zeal. Otherwise, our faith is just academic. We don't want to have zeal without knowledge, because then we'll go off into not necessarily doing the right things. But we got to have faith that transforms. Faith that transforms our hearts. Faith that causes us to act out our faith in actions. Again, going back to the dead faith that James warns against, and going back to Matthew chapter 7, we need to have that living, transformative faith if we're going to follow the golden rule and actively do to others that we wish they would do to us. So again, we can't show our faith by simply not punching each other in the arm. Show our faith by saying, brother, your arm is in a sling today. Silly example. Is something happened? You okay? Is there anything we could do for you? Anything we could do to look out and help get through the challenge? Now, an arm in a sling, punching an arm is, silly physical examples. But it goes deeper than that. Not all challenges are on the surface. And not all the harm to abstain from is on the surface too. So we got to think deeper about that too. In the middle of the page, point 2, right in the middle of the page, page 38, the author summarized that by saying, the law motivates the negative, love motivates the positive. Law motivates the negative. So what do y'all think that means there? What did the Pharisees focus on? They focused on what not to do. The law motivates the negative, thou shalt not. What's that?
They focused on their interpretation of the law and their traditions, and that's what they try to find.
Yep. So the question, what did the Pharisees focus on? Going back to the law, Ruth Ann says they focused on their interpretation. They made a hedge. They focused on what not to do. You think about all the encounters, the Pharisees said, you apostles are sinning by doing this. Jesus sinned by healing on the Sabbath. They focused on not. But they didn't say what you should do instead. They said, well, Jesus, you broke the Sabbath by healing on the Sabbath. They didn't offer an alternative to the law. And then the other point the author makes, love motivates the positive. Again, making that point, if we have love, we should be motivated by transformative. If we have spiritual love, we should have motivation from transformative faith to go and do good things for the brethren and also our neighbors that we see that are in need and we have opportunity. Yeah, excellent points. I'm going to try and summarize so everybody get here. A few key things that hit home with me there. One, we can't swing too far to one side that we exclude the other. You can't just focus on not or anything like that. The laws of morality about things that we don't do, that not doing could be a form of love. Doug had the example, if I love my brother, I will not steal from my brother. That's a form of expressing love. Sometimes when you resist those temptations, you can resist temptations motivated by love for others. So excellent point. Thanks for making that point, Doug. And that goes along really well with point B in the book, middle of the page on 38. It says, love motivates the Christ follower. Only those with a heart for Christ can live this way. Only a follower of Jesus will forgive as he wishes to be forgiven, will help as he wishes to be helped, will praise as he wishes to be praised, will understand as he wishes to be understood. And if you think about that, the love of Christ motivates to do these things which are against our human nature, which require us to get out of our comfort zone. It might be easier to resist certain temptations not to steal from a brother, as Doug used that example. I love my brother. I will not steal from my brother. However, it takes me a bit getting out of my comfort zone to show active love for my brother and to do the opposite of stealing, which is to give and to provide. People that don't follow Christ, what's the motivation? What's the motivation for that self-sacrificial love? Here, love motivates a Christ follower because we see the example of love from Christ to us. If you don't have Christ, you don't have that same example and that role model and that worldview to follow. So following that in the book, there's an example of the world follower versus the Christ follower. The worldly mindset will say, I am not breaking any laws, therefore I'm doing good. The Christian mindset says, I would choose a higher motivation of love. I'm not motivated by fear of, being a criminal. I'm not motivated by fear of, criminal punishment. I'm motivated to do positive things by love. Next, the worldly mindset will say I'm not hurting anybody. The Christian mindset will say I'm looking for people to help. Again, going back to the definition of the neighbor that Donnie brought up, is people around us in need, and then we have opportunity to serve. Next, the worldly mindset will say I don't want to get involved. I assume with people that need help. The Christian mindset says Jesus got involved and I will too. So again, think about what motivation we have as followers of Christ, that, a secular worldview, where is the motivation for the self-sacrifice? Now on page 39, the author talks about the iron rule. So let's talk about if you have the golden rule, without the Christ-like mindset. The iron rule, the author calls this, is basically the might makes right rule. Iron rule. Iron is associated with strength, power. Might makes right. The book has the example of King David. King David abused his powers at times. Think about Bathsheba. Bathsheba. The biggest example of that. And we see others in the Bible that took advantage of their power, their authority, and they showed the iron rule instead of the golden rule. And we see that, in our lives all the times. There's people that try and do underhand things to get ahead or take advantage of others or all sorts of things like that. So as Christians, we need to make sure that we are doing our best to be a light in the world to, counteract the iron rule, which is basically the rule of nature without God. Might makes right. Any thoughts on that? Donnie? We do have the Good Samaritan in here. Let's see, we'll go ahead and turn there. It does have the Good Samaritan in, let's go ahead and turn there. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, good, Donnie. Let's all turn to Luke chapter 10. Somehow, Donnie, I don't know if he just reads ahead or if he's just really good he's always a step ahead. He's keeping the class moving along. Yep, exactly. That's what I was talking about earlier, learning from each other. All right, let's turn to Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 29. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead." So here is an example of the iron rule. Might makes right. The robbers justified their actions by saying they had the power to go and beat up this poor victim. We see that all around us. Might makes right. It's not necessarily physical right, but it could be taking advantage of authority or anything. Continuing in verse 31. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came down to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So this is that passive rule, or that silver rule, as Donnie called it. So that's saying, well, I see somebody laying in that ditch, bleeding. Well, if I was laying in the ditch bleeding, I wouldn't want anybody to come up and kick me one more time or look and see if I had a wallet on me. Therefore, I will show my love for him by not kicking him and not looking for his wallet. That's kind of that misinterpretation of the golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. But now, as Jesus says, do to others actively what you do want done to yourself. So we can't be passive in the sense we can't see and observe and walk on by. We aren't loving our neighbor. That means we have a dead faith. Say, I believe in Jesus' love, and I see somebody who needs Jesus' love, but I'm going to show self-love by not taking myself out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to show a passive, dead love by not kicking him and looking for his wallet. So again, we got to get out of our comfort zone, not just abstain from doing bad things, not just abstain from making things worse, but get out of our comfort zone and do something that we want done to us if we're in the same situation. Now let's continue reading on in verse 33, and we see the illustration of the golden rule put into action. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend I will repay you when I come back. Which one of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. So, the golden rule, the Samaritan. First, what is the significance of the Samaritan?
Well, he is the least likely of all men to help you, especially in ministry.
Yep.
And despite the least likely candidate to help this man, he's the one who did it.
Yep. So the Samaritan was the least liked by the Jews. They got a long, dirty history between them. They've had centuries of Hatfield and McCoy. They can't get along. Jews would avoid Samaria at all costs. They were dogs to the Jews, but you see here, someone who'd be the least likely to help somebody went out of the way to help somebody who was just culturally night and day difference. Think about this too. A Samaritan is also more likely to have that same fate happen to him. If a Samaritan was walking down the road and Jewish robbers saw a Jew and a Samaritan, who do you think that they would want to go and beat up on? And if a Samaritan took an injured Jew to an inn and gave money, 2 denarii, how much is a denarii? Remember that? A day's wage. Give them 2 days worth of your pay. It says, if you need more, I'll give you more. Who is more likely to be taken advantage of if you have a crooked innkeeper? An innkeeper could say, oh, this Samaritan, I'm going to swindle him and say, oh, I need 2 or 3 more denarii. I'll take good care of him, but give me more money. So a Samaritan who is most likely to be taken advantage of, most likely to be beaten up on, is going to put himself at a greater risk than a Jew would have faced. So the Samaritan not only showed love for the injured person, but put himself at a greater risk of physical harm and a greater risk of being taken advantage of. And so if a Samaritan could go and put himself in harm's way to show love, we need to go and do likewise, as Christ says. So this isn't just for people that we like, is it? It's not for people that could go and repay us like for like. It is not for people that we could go and get some advantage out of that. In the story, the Samaritan didn't say, when I come back, I want him to repay me. A lot of things that we could learn. So the golden rule, if a Samaritan was laid up by robbers, the Samaritan would want somebody to come and help him out, help get him to a safe place so he could nurse back to health. Therefore, the Samaritan did the same. So a pretty clear-cut example here of the expectations. Our comfort zone isn't yay wide. Our comfort zone involves putting ourselves at our own risk and disadvantage if that's what it takes to go and help out a brother.
You know, another interesting thing, you got a priest and a Levite, and they both knew the law,
Mm-hmm.
and they knew if we were stated here, the golden rule is the summation of the law of the prophets even before the New Testament times. Then these people knew that that was the intent of God, was to do good to others.
Hmm.
And here are two men, one from whom the priest come, and another who is a priest from that tribe of Levi. And both of them, instead of applying what they knew, they ignored it and went on their own way.
Yep.
I mean, it shows not only the passiveness, but to me, the rebelliousness to what they knew they were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's an excellent point, Doug. Thanks for going deeper into this. So, to paraphrase so everybody could hear, Doug calls out that the first two people were a priest and a Levite who should have known better. Of all the Jews, they should have known best what to do in that situation. But I'm sure they walked by perfectly justified saying, well, I didn't kill anybody. I walked by that poor soul in the ditch and I didn't covet what he had. They could justify walking on by not doing anything to make it worse. However, they missed the whole intent of the law, which is to be like God, be pure, holy, and loving. Pure. I combine holy and pure, I guess. That's not what I want to be known for. Let me take another sip of coffee and we'll continue. Yeah. Yep. The equivalent to a preacher and elder walking on by. That's a good point. Let's go back to the law and the prophets itself in the few minutes we have left. In the book, point 3 on page 30 calls it an old principle. Let's turn together to Leviticus chapter 19. Now, continuing those same thoughts about the Levite and the priest ought to know better, as they were responsible for not only leading worship and conducting the purity rites and sacrifices and so on, they would be teaching the law, helping to understand the law. In verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Throughout Leviticus, we read, be holy, for I am holy. We are to be like God. In the Old Testament times, the Hebrew God was unique in many ways. One of the ways because the followers of the Hebrew God were commanded to be like the Hebrew God. If you compare the Hebrew God to other pagan gods of that time, there was not that same, be like Baal, be like the Ashtaroth, be like Issachar. You don't see that. We have a holy God. You are to be holy. You are to be pure like Yahweh God. You are to love like Yahweh God loves. Now let's turn earlier in Leviticus chapter 19. We see some other applications. Verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. The chapter is summarized by love your neighbor as yourself. And here, the law of gleanings. The Hebrews, the Israelites, would have to leave something in the field for the poor to come by and collect for their own. They didn't have the food pantries and stuff like that we have today. That was a form of charity, was to hold back. Don't take 100% of your harvest, leave some for the others. Love your neighbor as yourself, because if you didn't have a harvest, you would want somebody to share their harvest with you. Here, they showed love for their neighbor by leaving some for their neighbor to come and take. Exactly. Yep. And the story of Ruth, Doug calls out, that whole relationship, Ruth and Boaz, begins with the law of gleanings and coming behind in time of impoverishment. So, yeah, good correlation there. Thank you. Verse 11 through 14, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another, you shall not swear by name falsely, and so proclaim the name of God. I am the Lord. So these things about not stealing, not lying about each other, that's not just so they'd have civil order. That'd be so that they'd be imitating God. We read this in verse 13. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your Lord. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. So again, you can't be taking advantage of people. You talk about cursing the deaf when they can't hear and defend themselves, putting something in front of the blind where they're going to trip. You have to look out for the disadvantaged and show love for them because God loves you. So Jesus didn't start with the golden rule. Jesus summarized the golden rule to explain everything that we read in the Mosaic Law. And we won't go any further in Leviticus at this time, but the point is, Jesus was reminding us of the whole purpose of the law, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to love the Lord with all our heart, soul, and mind. And everything else that we read about in the law is specific applications to help people understand how to execute that daily in your life. Love for others is not a theoretical law, but we see dozens of examples on how to put that into actions. And again, thinking about the Pharisees, comments earlier about they focus on their interpretation, they focus on what not to do, and they forgot the whole purpose of loving each other and being pure and holy and loving as the true God was. So we're about out of time. Appreciate all the conversation in this class. There's more specifics in the book if you want to keep reading. There's applications for marriage, business, churches, our age groups, our peers. So no matter what we do, let's just not hold back from hurting each other. Let's look for ways to help heal, to love, support, and provide. And let's make sure we have an active, transformative faith, thinking about what we want done to us and actively trying to do that to others so we could put the love of Christ into action in our daily lives. All right. Everybody, thanks for class. Enjoyed it.